Alright, so in this video we're going to look at adding fractions with uncommon denominators. So when dealing with this, we're going to utilize that idea of equivalency in order to establish common denominators. So recall that we can multiply a fraction by this big 1, and essentially it's just another way of representing a whole quantity where the numerator and denominator are the same. So just to touch up on this, um, imagine we have this rectangle, right, where everything is shaded. Now this rectangle represents the quantity 1. Now we can break this rectangle in half, the very same rectangle, and represent this as a fraction. So here we have two areas, two portions shaded out of the two portions that we began with. Yet again, we can break this very same rectangle into 3 equal portions if we wanted to, where each portion is shaded, and this will represent the fraction 3/3. And we can do this infinitely many times. So this is, in this one right here, we broke it into 4 equal portions. Now, this is a really important concept to grasp when dealing with fractions with uncommon denominators. So now let's look at an example where we're going to add two fractions that have uncommon denominators. Alright, so off the top of my head, let's see, I'm going to want to add the fraction 3/7 plus, let's see, 1/6. So usually if we had, we were adding fractions which shared a common denominator, so for example, say off to the side, let's just look at this example really quick, 3/7 plus, say, 1/7, all we would do is carry the denominator out and then we would add the numerators together. So we would end up having 3 plus 1, and that would give us 4/7. But in this case, we're not really allowed to do this because we can't carry over a single denominator because both values have different denominators. So what we want to do is utilize equivalent fractions in order to find a common denominator, in order to establish a common denominator between the two denominators that we're given. So the idea is to apply the least common multiple. We want to find the least common multiple between 7 and 6. Alright, so on top, I'm going to indicate which multiple we're taking. What are we multiplying the value by? So we have 7 times 1 gives us 7, 7 times 2 gives us 14, 7 times 3 gives us 21, 7 times 4 gives us 28, 7 times 5 gives us 35, 7 times 6 gives us 42, 7 times 7 gives us 49, and so on and so on and so on. Now we want to do the same thing for 6. 6 times 1 gives us 6, 6 times 2 gives us 12, 6 times 3 gives us 18, 6 times 4 gives us 24, 6 times 5 gives us 30, 6 times 6 gives us 36, and 6 times 7 gives us 42. And essentially what we want to do is list as many multiples until we find a multiple that is common between two, and namely the least common multiple. So in our case, we see that the least common multiple is 42. Now, moving right along, we're going to utilize equivalent fractions. So we want to somehow get the 3 over 7 to have an, we want to represent it as an equivalent fraction with a denominator 42. And the same thing for 1 over 6, where we want to represent it with a denominator of 42. So just going back with the information that we had earlier when we were looking at multiples of 7 and multiples of 6, we saw that 7 times 6 gave us 42. So when multiplying the denominator, we must also, in order to get the new denominator, to find the equivalent fraction for that, we must also multiply the numerator. So what is applied to one must be applied to the other. So we have 3 times 6. This gives us 18. Now, in our little table that we had above, we see that 6 times 7 gave us 42. So 6 times 7 will give us 42 in the denominator, and what we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. So 7 times 1 gives us 7. Remember, this essentially is like a big 1 that we're multiplying it by. Same thing right here. This is essentially a big 1 because we're representing the quantity as 7 over 7, or 6 over 6, or 3 over 3, 4 over 4, 5 over 5, so on and so on. These fractions will reduce to just 1. Now that we have established a common denominator and utilize equivalent fractions to find the numerators, we can rewrite this problem as 18 over 42 plus 7 over 42. Now that we have a common denominator, we can write everything over this common denominator, and we will just begin to add the numerator. 18 plus 7 gives us 25, and it's all over 42. Now our last step would be to go over and check if we can reduce this fraction. We always want to express a fraction in its lowest terms by reducing it. Now, there's no value that we can reduce, no value that we can reduce the numerator and the denominator by. So this is as far as we can go. So this is in the simplest form, and with that, the process is going to be the same when also subtracting fractions with uncommon denominators. We're going to have to establish a common denominator by utilizing equivalent fractions, and to do so, we must find the least common multiple between the denominators. So with that in mind, that wraps up this section on fractions.